Okay, everybody, it is 3:30 on the dot here in Winnipeg. I'm going to start this webinar. Welcome to the IISD Experimental Lakes Area 2020 field season launch, a freshwater season like no other. Thank you very much for tuning into this virtual event. I hope you're all keeping safe and adapting to the new normal. We are very pleased today to be giving you an overview of our new normal and what the 2020 field season holds for IISD Experimental Lakes Area. Hope that this will be a fun, casual event, so please kick back and relax. Pour yourself an iced tea for those of you here in Winnipeg where it's warm and hot and sunny, or a glass of wine if that's what you prefer. We'll start this session with opening remarks from Dr. Richard Florizone, President and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We'll then hear from Dr. Matthew McCandless, Senior Director of Freshwater and Executive Director of IISD ELA, about what COVID-19 means for us as an organization. And then from Dr. Vince Pallas, Head Research Scientist at IISD ELA, about our plans for the field season and some thoughts we have about what COVID-19 may mean for freshwater science, both here in Canada and around the world. We'll have a question and answer session following Vince's presentation, where we'll open the chat line to all of you. So Matt and Vince can answer your questions. Any questions, we're happy to have any questions that you have about ELA specifically, or more broadly about the impact of COVID-19 on environmental monitoring, freshwater health, and research more broadly. We'll then finish off the event with a short video montage from some of our staff in the field and working from home. It's challenging with a virtual event to really meet everyone in person. It's one of the things that I really love about our season launch that we do every year. But we want to try in this way, in our own way, to help you put faces to names and meet some of our staff in person. We also want to say a huge thanks to all of our supporters, sponsors, partners, donors. We really wouldn't be here without all of you. Also, if there's any students on the call, shout out from the Education Outreach Program. We hope to show you some of our staff and some of the jobs that we have in freshwater science and hopefully maybe inspire you just a little bit. So a few housekeeping items before we start. This session is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent out following the call. We'll be doing the question and answer session via chat of Zoom. You can find this by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen and clicking on the chat option. If you have any questions while you're listening to Richard or Matt or Vince, please type them directly right as we go. I'll be reading the questions out after the presentations. Thanks for joining us. And without further ado, I'll pass the microphone over to Dr. Florizone.
Thanks, Pauline. It looks like we picked the same background, although mine looks a little backwards. So apologies, I'm not sure how I did that. Look, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and bring a few words of welcome to the launch of the 2020 research season at ELA, even though it's virtual and a little bit different. As Pauline said, my name's Dr. Richard Florizone. I'm the new CEO, President and CEO of IISD since January 2020. So I've just over, well, almost nearly 5 months on the job. You know, what drew me to IISD, we say here at the Institute, we talk about the Institute being that most of us are part scientist, part strategist. And we talk about delivering the knowledge to act. And I think that's what really drew me to the Institute. Right, is trying to make a real difference through sustainability, through scientific knowledge, through translating that knowledge into action. And ELA represents that so well. And, you know, it's not an exaggeration to say it's a jewel in the crown at IISD. And a couple of examples that many of you will know well. The fundamental work done on phosphorus showing its impact on algal blooms that literally has had an impact on the entire world. As is done some of the fundamental work we did on showing that the impacts of acid rain could be reversed. The list goes on. It's really great examples at ELA of local science with global impact, Canada making a difference. And I'm so pleased and proud to be a part of it now with all of you to help champion and support it. I want to just say before I hand it back to Pauline, priorities, expect good things ahead for ELA. There's 3 broad things we're talking about in our new strategic plan. We're talking, of course, about number 1, sustaining ELA as the world's most comprehensive long-term data set on monitoring of freshwater ecosystems. That's just so important over 50 plus years in running. We want to expand our research on the impact of contaminants, on invasive species, and eutrophication of the world's freshwater resources. Again, we have a unique resource to do that on these very, very important topics. And finally, and this webinar is an example of it with 130 plus of you, we want to expand our efforts to engage the Canadian public and folks around the world on the importance of freshwater sustainability. And so we're talking about building, improving our infrastructure out at the lakes, including a new Canada Centre for Climate and Lake Learning. With that, I just want to thank all our staff and supporters for their tireless work on ELA, especially at such an uncertain time. So thanks for your support and interest, and back to you, Pauline. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. I have to say it's been a real pleasure working with you over the last couple months. And having started at IISD only in January, you haven't had a chance to get to the ELA site yet, but I really, really look forward to showing you around, and hopefully we can fit in a campfire, maybe some music when you're there. You probably don't know, but there's a famous operations band that plays out of ELA, locally known in the region. Okay, so next up we have Dr. Matthew McCandless, Senior Director of Freshwater and Executive Director of IISD ELA. Matt has been our fearless leader since the Experimental Lakes Area was moved to IISD from the federal government in 2014. He has helped us navigate both ups and downs since then. I imagine COVID-19 and a global pandemic was not something he expected to have to address, but I really appreciate working with him and all the support he's given. So over to you, Matt, to give us your perspective and thoughts on where we are now.
Thank you, Pauline. And no, global pandemic was not in our 5-year plan. But good afternoon. On behalf of everyone at IISD Experimental Lakes Area, welcome and thank you for being a part of our virtual season launch. It will be a pleasure for us to showcase the work we're doing this year. We all know that this is a year like no other, but over the 50+ year history of ELA, it's not the first time that we will be facing unprecedented challenges, from forest fires to windstorms to funding cuts, and now a global pandemic. Our community has always found ways to keep the research going and, indeed, flourishing. This year will be no different. But we've had to make a few adjustments to how we conduct business. The amount of fieldwork data we will be collecting this year will be reduced, and some research will be delayed until next year. But we are still going to be able to get a lot of work done, as our head research scientist Vince will explain shortly. Just like every not-for-profit organization, our finances are affected by COVID-19. While I'm happy to say that all our funders and donors, including the Government of Ontario and the Government of Canada, have stood with us through this, and we've even had some new donations recently. So thanks to everyone who has supported us. We still depend heavily on your support from donors like yourself, and during this difficult time more than ever. We've had to reduce our budget this year because of decreased research activities, so we are especially grateful for all the support we receive from our government and corporate research partners and from donors such as yourselves. Again, thank you. And this support will continue to be essential as we move forward beyond COVID-19 and look for further growth at IISD Experimental Lakes Area. The COVID pandemic is showing the world the value of investing in science. And we're stepping up with big plans to increase water science at IISD ELA. Two of the big things we're working on are building up an endowment fund, which was launched with a matching grant from Michael Patterson and Gail Asper during our 50th anniversary celebrations in 2018. This will better ensure that we can weather things like this pandemic and whatever else the future may bring. We also have plans to build, as Richard mentioned, Canada's first Centre for Climate and Lake Learning to welcome local communities, educate and nurture the next generation of freshwater scientists, and inspire the world. You can read all about some of our exciting plans in this new Case for Support brochure, which will be linked in the chat section of this webinar. Unfortunately, we cannot welcome visitors to our site this year because we are only allowing essential staff on site. But our plans include new projects so that we can welcome more visitors, more high school students, and more researchers to the world's freshwater lab than ever before. Again, you can read about it right here. But back to this year. We'll be running a research season, but it will look very different. We need to get the science done, but we also need to protect our staff and the communities we work in. For anyone who has been to the ELA field station, you will know that social distancing is not possible in the close confines of our camp and while doing field work. So if the virus were ever to arrive in our camp, it would be very difficult to contain. Therefore, our objective is to prevent it from arriving in the first place. And unfortunately, that means that access to the site needs to be restricted. As I mentioned before, there will be no tours or visits to IISD ELA this summer. And for the foreseeable future, only regular IISD ELA staff will be visiting the facility, and only those who have been self-isolating for at least 2 weeks prior to their visit and show no symptoms of illness. But even with these restrictions, we will be continuing ELA research into its 52nd year. And again, thank you. This is has a lot to do with the support that we receive from donors such as yourselves. And now, our head research scientist, Vince Pallas, will explain how we are going to get it done this year. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. Interesting times and an interesting year. As this launch is aptly titled, this is a field season like no other. Vince Pallas has been with IISD Experimental Lakes Area since he came from Stantec Engineering, and before that from DFO in 2016. Vince will give us an overview of what can be expected at IISD ELA this summer, and of what impacts we're seeing on freshwater science as a result of COVID-19. Just a quick reminder, please type any questions you may have into the chat box as Vince is going. I'm going to do a question and answer session after that, and so please queue up your questions. Okay, over to you, Vince.
Thanks very much, Pauline. I'm very excited to be here today. I got to be honest, I'd much rather be out at the Experimental Lakes Area doing the research and talking with you folks in person. Those of you who can visit us. But this is the next best thing, and I am excited to show you some of the work that we will be doing this year, despite current circumstances. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and show you a few of the slides. Just, you don't need to stare at my face. There we are. How's that? So COVID has certainly changed our plans for the season. There's no doubt about that. But one of the best things about field researchers is that they're very, very adaptable people, and they usually can make a positive outcome of a very challenging situation. And there's definitely no exception here. This year, we will restrict access to the Experimental Lakes Area, as Matt mentioned, to just a small core team of professionals. As a matter of fact, they are out there right now collecting important data and making sure that we maintain the integrity of our 51+ year data set. And that small core group of professionals will also enable us to continue to monitor our ongoing studies. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the slides here. There we go. So while we won't begin any new in-lake studies, that's research that actually takes place within the actual lake, that doesn't mean we won't be busy. So those of us who aren't traveling to the field station, I will be later on this summer, but those of us who are in the city will be busy at home analyzing data, planning new studies, and producing important information to protect Canada's freshwater resources. The core group that I mentioned earlier, some of those who are actually at the field station now, will be collecting long-term data on climate change, algal blooms, and fish populations, among other things. So for example, we'll continue to add phosphorus to Lake 227 to induce algal blooms, as we have been doing for the past 51 years. 51 years. This is an amazing, globally unique project that has provided a wealth of information about algal blooms and continues to be an important part of our research. And that's the figure I've shown at the top left here, Lake 227, and you can see the algal bloom developing in there. We'll also continue to collect meteorological data to support our research on climate change. So that doesn't just include things like temperature and precipitation, but also things like ice phenology, or the life cycle of ice. So when ice forms on lakes in the fall and when it melts in the spring, and how things like lake size can affect that process. And that's some of the figure I've shown at the right-hand side here. And of course, fish. We'll continue to keep tabs on our fish populations. Their health is a very sensitive indicator of the state of our waters and the changes that are occurring with things like climate change, as well as some of the other experiments that we undertake. So just as we have a responsibility to maintain our lengthy data sets that are such an important global research, we also have responsibilities related to some of our ongoing research projects. So the ones that are begun or last year or the year before, And the one I've shown here is very near and dear to my heart. Last year, we conducted model oil spills in shoreline enclosure environments. We did this to develop even more refined models of how oil that is left behind after an oil spill cleanup, so the residual oil that can't actually be recovered, how that can more effectively be removed to really return the environment to its natural condition. Our core team, those who are out at the site now, will continue to collect samples to assess the effectiveness of the techniques that we tested last year. So this is a really unique study. Those enclosures remained in place for 2 years, and it'll provide real-world results to guide future cleanup efforts to protect our fresh waters. You can only see 4 of the enclosures here, but we actually had 18 of these in the study lake. One of the other core areas of research concerns prescription drugs that are excreted by humans and aren't completely removed by wastewater treatment facilities. So there are many drugs that can be found in the water released by wastewater treatment facilities, including things like pain medications, recreational drugs, antidepressants, and drugs that are used to control chronic medical conditions. Even caffeine can be found in wastewater effluent. The presence of even tiny quantities, minute quantities of these drugs in our waters is a concern because they can affect other animals. And let's think about it. We also use these waters as a source of drinking water. So last year, we conducted an 8-week-long mesocosm study following the fate and effects of the anti-diabetic drug metformin in water. So when I say we, I mean that IISD was a collaborator in this study, which was led by Dr. Aaron Ussery from Environment and Climate Change Canada, with partners from McMaster University and the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So that's a typical experiment at the Experimental Lakes Area. A lot of collaborative partners, a lot of people involved in the research, developing each, providing their expertise and developing a much larger project. In this case, the mesocosms that you can see, the little rings in the water there, were 2 meters in diameter, and they were treated with low concentrations similar to concentrations found in receiving water, of metformin. And we also had reference mesocosms that weren't treated with metformin. We always need something to compare with. We found that metformin actually was remarkably stable in the water column throughout the 8 weeks. So for 2 months, we made one addition and that concentration was maintained in the water column. And that's just shown by the graph here at the left-hand side. You can see the disappearance from the water column, which was almost non-existent. We also saw a significant decrease in the presence of some types of algae during year 1. So there is the potential for altered productivity of the entire systems. And we will be following up. Again, this is another study that's gone on for 2 years. The ice was very kind to us this year and allowed our mesocosms, our enclosures, to remain in place. So we have the opportunity to study these processes for 2 years, really unprecedented sort of globally. In the coming year, again, that core team will access these mesocosms, provide samples for us, and we will be able to follow that for the 2 years. Continuing on a theme here, similar to the vein of the metformin study, we've also begun a new study on the modeled antidepressant medication found in wastewater. So this study is being led by the IISD Experimental Lakes Area, but again with collaborative contributions from the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Manitoba, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Venlafaxine is amongst the most prescribed antidepressants globally, and residues of it are routinely found in lakes and rivers that receive treated water from wastewater treatment facilities. But we know very little about the potential effects of this compound in freshwater systems. Keep in mind that many of the biological systems that control human metabolism have very, very similar processes in other animals, including fish. And so there is the potential to disrupt their function, the fish and other animals that are exposed, by exposing them to minute quantities of these drugs in the environment. So obviously, the venlafaxine study is a newly funded project, and obviously we won't be able to get out to do in the lake studies this year, but we will have an opportunity to refine our chemical measurements and our systems for collecting samples, and also to perform some pilot studies. And pilot studies will be performed in large mesocosm tubs. Those are, some of them are shown in the left-hand figure here, prior to next field season's full-scale study. And so we often use these kinds of tubs as a first step to refine our calculations and addition methods and refine our sampling processes before we proceed with in-lake studies. So this is an excellent opportunity for us to do that this year. Another one of our new projects is focused on a newly legalized drug in Canada, cannabis. Usage patterns, shown by the graph here on the right-hand side, have increased since medicinal and more recently general legalization. And you can see that since the 60s, we've seen a large increase in this. Again, this means that metabolites from cannabis can increasingly find their way into lakes and rivers. And so the two main compounds of interest here from cannabis are, of course, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol, or CBD. Both have been identified in wastewaters, but again, there's very little known about their potential effects in freshwater ecosystems. So we will develop more information on these two compounds using 3 study approaches, and 2 of these we can actually tackle this year, even with COVID restrictions. First, in collaboration with scientists from the University of Manitoba and McMaster University, we'll collect samples of water in the region of wastewater treatment releases, and we'll look for the presence of these compounds and how their concentrations can vary seasonally. This winter, we'll also be able to conduct laboratory exposures using model organisms to see how their behavior and their health is affected. And those 2 activities will then allow us to go forward with in-the-field tests next year, again, probably using enclosures to examine potential ecosystem level impacts of cannabis metabolites. Enclosures allow us a large degree of control over the exposures. And finally, we're always looking at how changing conditions can affect our freshwater system, and that applies now more than ever. It's too early to tell if COVID may have an impact on things like climate change, sort of related to reduced transportation and reduced fossil fuel use. That's why it's so important that we continue to collect the sort of data that we do, the long-term climate change. This allows us to examine questions just like this. Long-term data sets are extremely important, and ours is amongst the most globally unique. But COVID may also introduce new threats to our ecosystems. For example, recent emphasis on disinfection has raised concerns regarding the volume of cleaning products that may find their way into wastewater treatment facilities. So this figure shows the type of cleaning chemicals found in commercial products. Quaternary ammonium compounds are among the most common. So those are shown in the graph at the bottom in the red bar. In fact, almost 70% of all the disinfectants recommended for COVID defense contain quaternary ammonium compounds. We know that QACs are relatively stable, and preliminary data indicates that they may also be quite toxic to freshwater organisms. But beyond that, very little is known regarding their stability and their effects on whole ecosystems. So during this time of self-isolation, our team has been reviewing the existing knowledge of QACs. Again, there isn't a lot known, and we're developing a plan and, of course, writing funding proposals to examine the effect and fate of QACs in freshwater so that we can better manage the balance between the need to reduce infectious disease transmission and still protect our freshwater. So that gives you a pretty good snapshot of some of the work that we will continue to do at the ELA this year. Of course, there are others I haven't had time to touch on, but we may mention during the question period. So thanks very much for your attention. And I'm now going to hand it back to Pauline so that she can facilitate the question period. Let me see if I can stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, Vince, if you could stop sharing but keep your video on, and Matt, if you could start your video back up again so we can see you, that would be fantastic. Thanks very much, Vince. That was really great. It's really, really interesting to see what people are thinking about and possible science that may be coming up out of all of this. I'm also really happy to say that we have 148 participants on this webinar and this virtual launch. So hello to everybody. There's people from Switzerland, New Zealand, Hecla Island in Manitoba, Ohio, British Columbia. We usually do the season launch in April every year as an in-person event here in Winnipeg. And this year, it's really exciting to see what we can do virtually and how many more people we can reach all around the world. Because really, the work that we do at the Experimental Lakes Area is impactful and has resonance all around the world. So we'll now enter the question and answer portion of the event. I really wish we could actually hear all of your voices and see your faces, but given technology challenges, we've decided to make things simple and just use the chat. Please type any questions that you have into the chat function. I'll be facilitating and reading the questions out as we go. And please note that we're happy to take questions about ELA specifically, but also about freshwater health more broadly. As a facilitator, I'm going to take facilitator's prerogative because I like to do that and ask the first question. So Vince, you spoke a little bit about QACs and some upcoming research that you see potential for IISD ELA. But I wonder if you could speak more broadly about impacts of the drastic changes that we're having here in society, really around the world, but specifically here in Canada, and how the impacts we may see those impacts on freshwater science and freshwater health.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and something I've thought a little bit about over the last little while. You know, we used to be able to track concern for the environment, concern for freshwater, sort of reciprocally with the economy. When the economy was really good, there was support, there was money for freshwater science, for science in general. And then when, you know, things went sort of south economy-wise, it was a bit more of a struggle for us. And I think we're starting to see a separation of that sort of reciprocal tracking. You know, especially now, I think people are aware that, you know, investment in science and investment in freshwater science is part of the economy, and we can't necessarily separate those. I think, you know, it's too early to tell what COVID will do, but I think we'll start to see a separation in that. And one of the interesting sort of sidelines is that is we're starting to see community-based monitoring, community-driven monitoring become even more important in terms of generating increased amounts of data for freshwater science. And I think there's a tremendous capacity there and a tremendous power to transcend those economic considerations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Matt, you lead the work for IISD Experimental Lakes Area, but also our water policy work globally. What kinds of impacts are you seeing related to COVID-19 and freshwater health around the world?
Well, it's interesting. There's sort of the impact of COVID itself on water quality, but then there's also the impact of COVID itself on water quality research. And as we know from the ELA field station, our activity level will be decreased. We'll be collecting less data, but that's actually a phenomenon that we're going to be seeing across the world, not just in freshwater research, but on things like oceanography, Arctic research. A lot of field work isn't going to be collected. And as a result, a lot of data, which will help us understand the impact of COVID won't be there. So there are a lot of interesting anecdotes. We've seen probably stories of things like reduced boat motor induced turbidity in Venetian canals and things like that. But the challenge is going to be actually collecting data so that these anecdotes actually become something that more than just interesting stories. So that's really an important thing, and it sort of forces researchers like us to think about how we do things and whether or not we should be thinking about more automation and whether there's more technological options that can help us collect data when it's not possible to do field work. So those are just some of the sort of broader things that we're seeing around COVID and water quality research globally.
So Vince, we have a question from the panelists, from the attendees. Is there a need to contextualize the data collected from ELA this year in terms of the pandemic? Could certain data points be influenced by COVID-19 related activities or lack of activities?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think, you know, it'll be maybe a blip. It'll be maybe something that we can pick up with our long-term data set. I do think it's important to put these kinds of events in context, and the folks who look at the long-term data sets, that's not necessarily, you know, something that I do, but some of other scientists really are engrossed in that. I think, as I mentioned in my talk, that's the value of having the long-term data set, is understanding variability of climate, understanding the trajectories of it, understanding how they link to productivity of our freshwater systems, and then being able to put into context, you know, disruptions. And disruptions can take any number of forms, whether they're chemical disruptions, physical disruptions, or in this case, you know, a disrupted sort of global energy flow, how that will affect those systems. I think it'll be a really interesting use of our long-term data set and will show the power of it in looking at, for example, the reduction of fossil fuel use that we've seen because of COVID right now. Will that show up in our long-term data set? And will it show up in global data sets?
So James Abbott is wondering if IISD LA has ever done any work or is planning any work on road salts.
We would love to do some work on road salts. I think this is one of the most long-standing proposals that we've had, and I think many, several scientists have sort of taken it and run with it for a bit, and we always seem to run into the same thing, and that is, when we go to do potential impacts, oftentimes we do this in collaboration with some industrial partner, and in this case, the most appropriate partner seems to be either a municipal, a provincial, or a federal government consortium. And really right now, the appetite hasn't been there to fund that. It's a relatively simple study to do. It's something that's well within our wheelhouse. We just haven't found a funding base for it. I do think it applies to other things. It applies to agricultural drainage in terms of increased salinization. It applies to just climate change and how that increases salinization in certain regions of the globe. It applies to the oil sands, for example, as well, because of the salinity issues there. So it's an important study. We just haven't found a funding base for it yet.
Kelly Saunders is wondering, will the research on drugs and QACs in wastewater be used to also determine potential effects on human health via drinking water?
I guess that's part of the use of the data is oftentimes we provide that data and then other folks who are sort of more epidemiological in their approaches or those who are more human health experts can take off on that. It's generally not something that we make advice on in terms of human health. We certainly provide data to those streams. But we're sort of more focused on ecosystem health and the organisms living within those freshwater ecosystems. I guess, there are some vulnerabilities in terms of making recommendations for human health that just because of our expertise doesn't sit well. But, we're definitely open to collaborating with human health experts. I think it's one of the things that's a great thing about IISD relative to our former life as a government-related agency, and that is we are open to far greater opportunities to collaborate with others.
Matt, this one's for you and one that's close to my own heart. How has the COVID-19 restrictions affected student positions at IISD LA?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This pandemic happened while we were in the process of hiring our summer students for the year. Normally we hire about a dozen or so, and we have probably at least a dozen graduate students resident at ELA all year. But what we were able to do was we were able to continue the hiring process for the students that we have hired. So they are all employed. Everyone who was offered a summer job is still working, which is great. But unfortunately, they won't all be doing field work. In fact, most of them won't be doing any field work. They'll be working from home. We, of course, have a major backlog on data and analysis, and it presents a good opportunity for a lot of students to do some of this work, doing data crunching, writing papers and such. So we have a full slate of summer students, but their work assignments are a lot different. No more hauling sandbags this year, but a lot more heavy lifting of data.
Yeah, I was very happy that we're able to keep summer students on this year, even given everything. And it'll be really interesting to see the work that they're able to churn out too. So Ian Stewart from Geneva, it's great to see you online, is asking, have you noticed a COVID-19 impact on lakes? Have we seen that yet? Vince?
I don't know that we've had an opportunity to get to probe that question yet. I mean, and I don't think we're looking for direct sort of impacts. We're looking for indirect impacts of other things that have happened because of COVID, like I mentioned before, the reduction in fossil fuel use and travel, et cetera. Yeah, that's as far as we've gotten to this point.
So Vince, from Steve, specifically what studies are ongoing on the impacts of climate change and water quality?
Yeah, so I mean, again, the long-term experiments that we have going on, the eutrophication studies obviously have a component of climate change within them. The most direct one that I mentioned before was the ice phenology study. This is a collaboration with NRCan, using satellite data, not just on our lakes at the Experimental Lakes Area, but using them as part of a larger data set. So looking at when ice comes onto a lake in the fall and when ice leaves in the spring. That has a lot to do with the productivity, the internal productivity of a system, you know, how long that ice cover can remain in place. So that's an important study, or important part of our core research as well.
Bruce is wondering about projects involving invasive species.
See, invasive species is obviously we're tracking those. We look at things like spiny water flea and whether or not they're you know, infiltrating our lakes. Oftentimes we're known as the manipulation people. You know, we are able to manipulate lakes either by adding contaminants or changing the flow patterns, changing thermal regimes, that sort of thing. And invasive species is kind of a no-go zone for us because whatever we do at the Experimental Lakes Area, we have to set that lake back to its original condition. That's one of the conditions for our occupation of the area. And once you introduce an invasive species, there's really not any way for us to sort of guarantee that we're going to be able to remove it afterwards. So in terms of introductions, we tread very, very lightly there. We haven't made any introductions. Having said that, there are some introductions that we can remove. So things like there's an expanse of smallmouth bass, believe it or not. Those are an invasive species in parts of northwestern Ontario. So we're working with the provincial agencies, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, to look at whether or not we can design some studies to look at how an invasive species like smallmouth bass might affect the energy flow of a system.
Okay, great. So Norman Yan is wondering if any research has been done on viruses specifically at ELA, and how long enteric viruses might last in water, and if this might be related to COVID.
Yeah, again, I think we haven't got there yet. I do think that there is an open door for us to be able to do some of this stuff. We've oftentimes been, again, I say historically, been concentrating on the freshwater ecosystems and its productivity. We have an open door now to be able to do more collaborative work with terrestrial biologists, human health experts, et cetera. And so I think we have an interest definitely in starting this type of research. I think we need to explore the partners that we would need to bring on to do that kind of work. But we're definitely open to that. That would be a really good use of our facility, I think.
So Matt, the next two are for you. The first one is obviously close to my heart, but can you talk a little bit about how current operating procedures are influencing our education outreach programs in the immediate future?
Well, I could certainly turn this one back to you for follow-up, Pauline, but really our education and outreach activities are, of course, hampered by the fact that we can't have tours at ELA. Schools that we would normally visit are out of class, although we've had some alternative ways to engage students through webinars and such. So I'd say it hasn't really changed at all, but it's definitely looks different. It's happening remotely. It's happening through things like this. So I'll turn it back to you, Pauline, since this is, of course, the program that you direct. So you can speak better than anyone else.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say that we are able to keep our education outreach assistant on, and she has been doing classroom presentations virtually with for students and teachers over the last couple of months. And we're working quite hard to try and make the content that we have available for teachers and students. I've talked to lots of teachers and know from my own kids' teachers that they're looking for good content. So I would encourage all of you to go onto our website and check out the really great videos. We even have one in Ojibwe language right now, which is fantastic. So it's also making it led us to reflect a little bit about our content and what we have online, and hopefully we'll be improving that over the next couple of years. So that's a benefit of what's going on now. Matt, this is another one for you from Ray Hessline. Has the limited access to ELA prompted consideration of automating more data collection and sample collection?
That's a good question, and it's actually something that we've been thinking about and working on for a while now, even before this pandemic happened. So we were lucky that we had some things ready. We've deployed spawns in a couple of lakes, I believe, and we're looking to have those communicate directly through our local radio and communication towers, so that we can access this data in real time. So it was experimental, but it's something that we sort of accelerated the timeline on, so that we could continue to collect some data because of the COVID pandemic. But really, it's something. The reason why we were looking at this in the first place is because field work is very labor intensive, and when there is a disruption in field work, then data declines. And of course, because of COVID, we are seeing this around all over the world. So more automation will allow us to do more remote data collection, perhaps collect greater volumes of data for more different types of analysis. So it is happening, and it's something that we are actually actively seeking to do a lot more of in the future.
So Vince, I've got two questions from Colin Carbno. One, how many lakes in your data set, and how many field workers are there at IISD ELA?
So we have 58. We have the opportunity to work on 58 lakes. That's the lakes that we have permission to work within. Not all of those are monitored every year. We have a core group of 5 lakes that are reference lakes that we monitor, more intensively, and then we rotate other lakes, looking at different parameters depending on the year, whether it's fish populations or nutrients, etc. And then in terms of on the ground researchers, I guess there's probably about 25 to 30 of us that are in the field on a normal year. And our version of sort of frontline workers right now constitutes the core group that I mentioned before. And I'm just going to give a shout out to them, because I really think we all owe them a real debt of gratitude. And that's Lee Renchuk, Ken Sandylands, Paul Baffert, Lauren Hayhurst, John Neal, Jesse Silo, our chef on site, and then Corey, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten Corey's last name. If someone can remind me, that'd be great.
We did get a note that they're watching from ELA. I'm not sure, the internet's been off and on, so I'm not sure how much they're getting, but I hope they heard that.
Well, big shout out to them. We really appreciate everything you're doing.
So this is a really great question, Vince, from Leanne Fournier. How can we do the required COVID-19 disinfecting in ways that are less harmful to our water systems?
Yeah, I think, I always go back to those little school-based programs that, sort of paint fish on the pavement near every drain. Just think about sort of what's going down the drain in terms of, it's nice to be sure that you're disinfecting a surface, but there's also overkill, right? And I think you use a disinfectant wipe, and some inclination is to sort of rinse that down the sink. It really should be treated in a different way. Understand that everything that's going down the drain eventually finds its way to a wastewater treatment facility. That wastewater treatment facility is not 100% effective in removing all different compounds. That's the basis of our research on pharmaceuticals. Very famous work that we did a while back looking at hormones from birth control pills, etc. It all finds its way there, and we aren't able to remove it completely. So just, I guess, keep that in mind. And there has to be a balance, right? There has to be a balance between keeping ourselves safe and also, being mindful of the water that we're affecting as well.
So I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then we're going to move to the last segment. There's lots of questions. We are going to send out a link to the feed after the webinar, as well as contact details. So we'd be happy to continue to answer questions via email after the webinar. Unfortunately, we can't get to everyone, but it's really great to see people's interests and just hear what people are wondering about. So in the current political climate, this one's for you, Matt. In the current political climate, is the current political climate affecting our international science cooperation?
Well, as we do sort of seek to connect our research internationally with other things, obviously travel restrictions are a huge thing. As many of you know, we were going to be hosting the International Association of Great Lake Researchers the IAGLR conference here in Winnipeg the week after next, and that's been canceled. It's moving to an online format. So a lot of this movement and interaction of researchers is really just completely ground to a halt. And this is, of course, COVID related, not necessarily related to international tensions. So it's certainly affected this year. As far as the political climate, I'd say our projects are longer term. So we don't necessarily see those as immediate, quite as immediately. So if there are changes in funding for international research and such, it's something that we may eventually see in the coming years. But as far as 2020 goes, things are I guess politically very much the same, but of course heavily changed by the global pandemic.
So Vince, for the last question, do you see any potential for community-based data collection in the surrounding area now that there's less opportunity for collection at ELA?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is one of the biggest pushes, one of the biggest exciting avenues of research over the past few years, and something that we've been attempting to become more and more involved with. I think there's an interest in communities collecting some of their own data, and there's, in some instances, you know, that training that's required from folks like us who collect scientific data, that training to communicate that to a community so that they're able to collect their own data and provide that in a usable format is not as big an issue as it used to be. And there's a lot of people out there with a good understanding of what it takes to collect careful data. And I think we'll see more and more that this will become part of the mainstream of scientific data collection. Not to say that, you know, formal experimentation like what we do and long-term data sets may not be sort of within the purview of different community-based groups, but they can definitely augment to a huge extent the scientific data collection process.
Okay, with that, I'm going to close the question and answer. We just don't have enough time, but please forward us your questions. We're happy to continue to answer them. You will receive, like I mentioned, a follow-up email to this event with a link to the recording as well as contact details for any further questions. So this last session is one that's really close to my heart. The downside of a virtual event is that we don't get an opportunity to meet all of our supporters, interested stakeholders, students, partners, donors in person. Although I am really amazed at the scope geographically of the people on the call, which is fantastic. But we wanted to give you an opportunity to see some of our staff firsthand and just get a feel for who they are and the freshwater science that they do. And I also want to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to all of our partner students and really anyone who's interested in freshwater science here in Canada, around the world. And I'm going to raise my glass especially to all the donors. Oh, you can't even see it. There you go. To all the donors out there, we wouldn't be here without you, and your support is very much needed. So the following is a 9-minute video montage of a number of staff, many of whom are out in the field right now, just explaining a little bit about who they are and what they do and why we think it's so important. So Matt and Vince, if you could turn your videos off, I'm going to share my screen. And play the video.
Hi, my name is Lauren Hayhurst, and I'm the Fisheries Research Biologist at IISD Experimental Lakes Area. I study fish populations, and we're on the shoreline of Lake 260. This is our sampling site. This is the oil spill lake. So even though the oil spill additions happened in enclosures, we're interested in studying the fish populations before, during, and after the manipulation, as is the case with all of our experimental lakes. And then we compare them to fish populations in our reference lakes over time to make sure there wasn't anything weird going on in the environment. So we have white sucker here. They spawn in the spring. We've caught them in our trap nets. It's really important because we have such small systems and small fish populations that we find non-lethal ways to treat our fish. So in this case, our capture is non-lethal. We do methods development for different biological sampling and how to take tissues without having to kill a fish. And then we anesthetize a fish and measure it instead of just taking a bunch back to the lab with us. So this fish is in the knockout bath. We've got some fish that are ready for measuring there. And we're looking to see basically if this fish has been captured before, and it has a pit tag. So that's its unique identifying number, or its name if you prefer. So we have these in our fish database. We can track them over time. We can see how often we've recaptured the fish, whether it's a multiple on the season or over time. And then we use that to come up with our population estimate. So it's very time intensive, effort intensive, but we wouldn't have it any other way. We are so thrilled to be out here doing this kind of work. I really love it. This is an example of the little pit tags that you guys have afforded us. They're about $3.50 each, and each one will go into all the different fish we have out here. Everything from these tiny fish tags to our quite a bit larger fish truck, you managed to make happen, and we're so excited and happy that you guys are as interested in this whole ecosystem research as we are. Thank you for your support.
Hi there, my name is Samantha Mirage and I am the Communications Manager at the Experimental Lakes Area. As you can probably tell, I am nowhere near a lake at the moment. I'm in my apartment, and in fact most of us are, to reduce the number of people who are out at the site and of course our Winnipeg office. However, panic over, do not worry, rest assured, we're all still working just as hard as ever, and I'm still doing my job, which is to make sure that all of the research that we do, the discoveries we make, and the scientific concepts that the work that we do is based on are communicated to anyone who's interested. Members of the general public, a student who's studying ecology, a member of industry, someone who works in government, and of course policymakers who take the research that we do and use it to make better freshwater policies and laws around the world to protect freshwater. I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson now. In 2014, the International Institute for Sustainable Development took over operation of the Experimental Lakes Area, and things changed. We wanted to open the site up, open the doors, both literally in terms of visitors, members of the public, and of course visiting researchers, but figuratively. We wanted to make sure that every person who wants to learn about our freshwater research just has to pick up their cell phone, read a blog on a website, listen to an interview on the TV, and they can learn more. It's been quite the learning curve for me, I have to admit. There is a very poorly kept secret around the office that I am no scientist myself. So a lot of these concepts, a lot of this research is quite new to me too. That's a good thing. It means that number one, I now know what lake stratification is, which is quite fascinating. If you want to learn more, head over to our website. It also means that I can ask the questions that you want answered and that I can communicate it in a language that you understand. Of course, we can't do any of this without your support. So I would like to thank you greatly for all of the support that you give us. I'd like to say that I hope you're doing well, and I hope we get to see each other in person next time.
Hey, I'm Blake Cooney, and I'm a research assistant here at the IISD ELA, and I work primarily in the chem lab. In the chem lab, we will process water samples from different lakes, from our experimental lakes to reference lakes, and long-term ecological research lakes as well. And we'll process them primarily for their nutrient chemistry. And we work out of a couple different pods. Each pod employs a student. And in those pods, we do different analyses. So in this pod, we'll run phosphorus and silica on that spec. And phosphorus, as you may know, is a leading cause of harmful algal blooms. So we're interested in that. And we need to be able to detect really low levels of phosphorus. Our lakes are so pristine out here that they're not contaminated with very high levels, so our analyses need to be very specific and sensitive. We also measure the inorganic carbon, the pH or the acidity of our lakes, and the conductivity or the salinity of our lakes. And all of these are play important roles in the chemistry and the overall dynamic of the lake. In this pod here, we focus on nitrogen, and as you can see, I'm standing between two very different machines. This one looks like a dinosaur, and this one is beautiful and they function like that as well. This one is completely automated, can run all of our samples, can run more samples, and we'll run them more sensitively too. And as I said, we do need sensitive analyses because our lakes are so clean. And we were only able to upgrade from this one to this one because of very generous donations from people like you. So thank you very much for making our job easier in the Chem Lab.
Hi there guys, my name is Jesse Coelho. I'm the head chef at IISD LA. Welcome to Hungry Hall. This is where I cook for the hordes of hungry scientists that flock to ELA every year. If you follow me into the kitchen, this is my lovely equipment that donors have paid for. This is where we serve the food. To upwards of 70 people a summer. This is our dishwasher that greatly helps me clean up and take care of dishes. This is the back area where you do baking, prepping, cooking, cleaning, take care of everything else. None of this would be possible without all your donations.
Hey, I'm Paul Baffert. I'm the hydrolytic technician. My job focuses on hydrology, the movement of water through the environment, and physical analogy, which is the study of lakes. I'm here at 239, which is our long-term reference lake right at camp. All of the data that we gather on 239 is to support the rest of our science. One of the most important things when you're studying lakes is to know how much water is moving in and out of the lake. Right here is the 239 outflow, and this is our gauging station. We're in the process of swapping out these old loggers, which are slowly dying and becoming obsolete, with these new loggers. And the purchase of all of these new loggers has been entirely through your generous support, which is exciting and awesome because we're switching these out at all of our stations, which standardizes the equipment we have, the data format that comes out of it, and that really helps us to process the data faster and more reliably, and really ultimately provide that evidence that we need for sound decision making. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Samantha Mirage. I'm an environmental studies co-op student from the University of Manitoba, specializing in environmental education. I've been working with IISD ELA since January as the Education and Outreach Assistant. I deliver educational presentations, and this past winter, I got to visit a grade 1 classroom. This presentation reminded me why we do what we do at ELA. I asked the students questions relating to freshwater and the important one of why do we do experiments on lakes that don't already have an issue. The responses were thoughtful, and you could tell they were really trying to think of things. It's conversations like those that remind me why education to all ages is so important, because although the work we do can be quite complicated, even 6- and 7-year-olds understand and think it's really cool. Your support means I'm able to educate and encourage people that what we do is valuable. Thank you for supporting the continued education and research of freshwater and whole ecosystem science.
Okay, perfect. That was really great. And just thanks to everyone who agreed to participate in that video. We hire freshwater scientists and cooks and facilities managers, not movie stars. And man, you can't even tell, they were so fantastic. It also kind of breaks my heart a little bit to see the chemistry lab and all the jokes. Those of you who haven't been there, you'll have to come in person. And Hungry Hall with very few people in it right now. But thanks, Jesse, for all of your work and cooking that you're doing even now. So with that, I'm going to draw to a close this virtual season launch of freshwater research like no other. I want to emulate everyone from the video and speak on behalf of all of our staff and say a huge thanks to all of you for your time participating in this event, as well as all of your support, even just to paying attention to the work that we do, talking about the work that we do. We would not be here without all of you. So please continue to pass on the word about IISD Experimental Lakes Area and the remarkable work that we do. You can always learn more on our website at isd.org/ELA. And if you can, consider a donation to support this amazing work. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a really great rest of your day. I raise a glass to you all.